Hi, and welcome to another episode of Patrik's Tech Lightning. In today's episode, I will talk about the design decisions required when you need a solution for an Azure Application Gateway together with an Azure Firewall. We will first start with a basic introduction of the two different resources within Azure, and we will look at the situation where you need to combine them or if you should use them alone. So let's dig into it. As usual, we'll first do a quick high-level overview of the two components, and we'll start with the Azure Firewall. Now, this is a managed next-generation firewall which offers packet filtering on layer 3 to 7. It can easily detect, alert, and deny traffic from malicious IP addresses along with other functionality. The premium version of Azure Firewall, now this is a full-fledged intrusion detection and prevention system, IDPS. Along with this, it can also function as a forward proxy where you can whitelist URLs. So any traffic to the internet from Azure can first be checked by the firewall. The application gateway, it only works with HTTPS traffic, where it functions as a full reverse proxy with SSL offloading. It can also use a web application firewall, WAF, to inspect web traffic and detect attacks at the HTTP layer. Important to keep in mind, it does not do IDPS. So let's make a quick table to see the different scenarios. If we look at the application flow, we have HTTPS traffic from on-premise or to the internet to Azure, inbound traffic. This can be filtered by the Azure Firewall and the application gateway. Then we have HTTPS traffic from Azure to the on-premise or to the internet, so outbound traffic. This can be filtered by the Azure Firewall using the forward proxy functionality. This is not possible with an application gateway. Then we have non-HTTPS traffic, inbound, coming in, and outbound. This can be filtered by the Azure Firewall, but the application gateway, it doesn't understand and cannot handle this type of traffic. These are the scenarios we're going to have a look at and which are available for us for designing. We can design an Azure Firewall alone. We can put an application gateway alone. We can have an Azure Firewall and an application gateway in parallel. We can have an application gateway in front of the Azure Firewall. We can put the Azure Firewall in front of the application gateway. So lots of cool options. Let's dig into the options then and see if we start with the Azure Firewall alone. Now, this is useful if there are no web-based workloads in the virtual network that can benefit from a web application firewall. All traffic is sent to the Azure Firewall, both inbound and outbound connections. Remember that Azure Firewall will not inspect inbound HTTPS traffic. However, it will be able to apply layer 3 and 4 rules and FQDN-based application rules. With Azure Firewall Premium, there are additional capabilities, such as inspecting HTTP headers and TLS inspection, but the functionality is not equal to that of an web application firewall. The strength here is that the Azure Firewall will inspect outbound traffic. Let's put up a drawing of some infrastructure. We have the big scary internet, and connected there we have an external user. Let's call him Patrik. In Azure, we have configured a VNet with an Azure Firewall and an application server. Now, incoming requests from the external user Patrik hits the public IP address of the Azure Firewall. The firewall, in its turn, sends the traffic on to the application server. Remember, this can be any type of traffic, both HTTPS and non-HTTPS traffic. The application responds back to the firewall and the return traffic gets to the external user. Outbound traffic initiated from the application goes through the firewall and out to the internet. The firewall in this case functions as a forward proxy and can perform functions such as URL whitelisting. This scenario is pretty simple. Now, what if we want to use just one application gateway without an Azure Firewall? Well, we'll use the same drawing as before, except we'll replace the firewall with an application gateway. This scenario is usually not recommended, as outbound initiated traffic from the application in Azure goes to the internet without passing the firewall. Now, the big difference here is that the application gateway, it behaves as a full-fledged reverse web application proxy. It means that application gateways stop the web session from the client and establish a separate session with one of the backend servers. Inbound HTTPS connections from the internet are sent to the public IP address of the application gateway. Return traffic from the application will go through the application gateway. But as I mentioned, outbound traffic flows initiated from the application VM will actually go directly to the internet and not to the application gateway. Now, let's have a look at integrating both components using both the application gateway and Azure Firewall in parallel. This is usually the best scenario, especially if you have a mix of different type of web and non-web workloads in an Azure virtual network. Azure WAF, it protects inbound traffic to the web workloads, and Azure Firewall, it inspects inbound traffic for other applications. Azure Firewall will also cover outbound flows from any workload, meaning both web and non-web workloads. If you require IDPS for your web workload, we need to use another scenario, namely one where the application gateway is before the firewall. The client then connects to the public IP address of the application gateway. The application gateway, its subnet, forwards the package to the Azure Firewall. Now, the Azure Firewall, it can perform IDPS and then forwards the traffic to the application VM. The VM answers the request, which then hits back to the Azure Firewall, and the Azure Firewall forwards the traffic to the application gateway, which in its turn answers the client. Now, this is the supported and required flow if there's a hard requirement for IDPS in combination with a web application firewall. The final scenario we will look at is having the application gateway after the Azure Firewall. The benefit here is the Azure Firewall, it can actually filter and discard malicious traffic before it reaches the application gateway. For example, it can apply features like threat intelligence based filtering. Now, there is a limited benefit in this scenario as the Azure Firewall can only see encrypted traffic going to the application gateway. So the question is, when would you use this solution? And it's a good question. Well, one example is if you need to use many public IP addresses for your application. The Azure Firewall is more flexible in that regards, and it allows for multiple public IP addresses, which is unlike the application gateway, which only supports one public IP address. We have come to the end now. I think this topic is very important when you design solutions in Azure. The question on Azure Firewall and the application gateway will undoubtedly come up as you discuss with your customer. So, what are the key takeaways that we can remember from this exciting session then? Well, application gateway only handles HTTPS traffic. If IDPS is a requirement, then you need a solution in an Azure Firewall. Azure Firewall, it's able to function as a forward proxy, handling outbound traffic from Azure. The Azure Firewall is costly, especially if you go for the premium version. So it's common to solution the Azure Firewall in a shared hub, which is then used by all the underlying subscription. The application gateway, on the other hand, is usually placed in the application subscription, but it can also be in the shared services next to the Azure Firewall. It really depends on your requirement. So that's all I had for this week, but next week will be another week. So we'll see you then. Take care.